The sun bled red across Black Mesa Valley, painting the Arizona sky in shades of crimson and gold that only the dying day could conjure. The old man sat in his rocking chair on the porch, his hands weathered and scarred, resting on the stock of a Winchester rifle that had seen 40 years of dust and blood. His name was Caleb Ashford, and at 77 years old, he had lived long enough to understand that some stories needed telling before the grave claimed them. Beside him stood a boy of 15, tall for his age but still carrying the awkward angles of youth. Thomas Ashford had his grandfather's eyes, that same pale gray that looked like storm clouds gathering over the desert. But where the old man's gaze held the weight of decades, the boy's eyes burned with something more dangerous. Rage, grief, the raw, untempered fury of someone who had lost everything and wanted the world to pay for it. "Grandfather," Thomas said, his voice tight, "I've made my decision. I'm going to enlist. I'm going to join the army and make them pay for what they did to Father." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He ran his fingers along the Winchester's worn barrel, feeling the ghost of 1,000 moments etched into the metal. The rifle was old, older than the boy standing before him. It had killed men. It had saved lives. It had witnessed things that most people in their comfortable homes would never understand. "Sit down, boy," Caleb said, finally, his voice rough as gravel. Thomas hesitated, then lowered himself onto the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath him, the same boards that had been laid down in 1879 after the fire, after the blood, after everything changed. Caleb leaned forward in his chair, the Winchester balanced across his knees. "Before you decide to throw your life into a war, before you let hatred guide your hand, I want you to hear something. A story about the time I had to choose between living safe or standing up for what was right." The boy turned to look at him, curiosity cutting through the anger. "What happened?" The old man's eyes drifted to the horizon where the sun continued its descent. "It was 1878. I was 37 years old. I'd already lost everything that mattered. Your grandmother Sarah, your Aunt Emma. The fever took them both in the winter of '75, and I came west because I couldn't bear to stay in that empty house in Virginia. I bought this land, filed my claim proper under the Homestead Act of 1862, 160 acres of hard earth and harder lessons." He paused, and for a moment the only sound was the evening wind rustling through the ponderosa pines behind the house. That summer was brutal. 110 degrees most days. The earth cracked so deep you could lose your hand in the fissures. I was riding the ridge that day, checking my boundaries when I saw the vultures. Thomas leaned forward, the anger in his eyes replaced by something else. Interest, connection. Caleb closed his eyes and the years peeled away like old paint. The vultures knew death better than any living creature in those parts. The vision took him, pulling him back through 4 decades back to the man he'd been before time had stooped his shoulders and silvered his hair. Back to the Arizona territory, to the heat and the dust and the day that changed everything. 1878, Black Mesa Valley, Arizona territory. The gelding beneath Caleb picked its way carefully along the ridgeline, its hooves finding purchase on rocks baked hard as iron by the relentless sun. Caleb squinted against the glare, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other holding the reins loose. He'd learned to ride with an easy hand during the war, during those long campaigns with the 3rd Virginia Cavalry, when a tense grip could mean a spooked horse and a bullet in your spine. The vultures circled in their patient spiral black specks against the burning sky. Caleb had seen enough death to recognize their meaning. Something was dying down in the ravine, or already dead. He should have ridden on. His fence line needed checking, and there were a dozen other tasks waiting back at the cabin. But something pulled him forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the soldier's instinct that had kept him alive through Gettysburg and Shiloh, the sense that recognized when something wasn't right in the world. He guided the gelding down the slope, the animal's haunches bunching as it descended the steep grade. The ravine opened up before him, a jagged scar in the earth, where flash floods had carved away the soil over countless seasons. The heat shimmered up from the ground in visible waves distorting the air. At first, he thought it was just an unusual rock formation, a mound of dirt that didn't quite match the surrounding terrain. Then he saw the hair black as midnight, spread across the packed earth like a mourner's shawl. And below it, a face. Caleb pulled his gelding to a halt and dismounted in one smooth motion, years of cavalry training making the movement automatic. His boots hit the ground, sending up small clouds of dust. His knee protested an old wound from Chancellorsville, but he ignored it. The woman was buried to her neck in the hard earth. Her face was baked red by the sun, lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were closed, but he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. Shallow breaths, the desperate rhythm of someone clinging to life by their fingernails. Around her throat hung a wooden sign, crude letters carved deep into the grain. The words made his jaw tighten. Harlot, cursed womb. Jesus, Caleb muttered. He'd seen a lot of cruelty in his 37 years. He'd watched men die screaming on battlefields, seen towns burned, and families destroyed. But there was something particularly cold about this. This was execution dressed up as righteousness. This was killing made holy. He pulled his Bowie knife from its sheath on his belt, a 10-inch blade that had served him through the war and beyond. The knife caught the sun flashing once before he knelt beside the woman and began to dig. The earth resisted. It had been packed down hard, baked by the sun, until it had the consistency of brick. Caleb worked the blade into the soil, prying and scraping, sweat dripping from his forehead, despite the wide brim of his hat. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and despite the obvious agony she was enduring, they held something that made Caleb pause. A fierce will, a determination that said she hadn't given up, not even buried alive in the desert heat. "Hold on," he said, his voice rough. "I'll get you out." He'd barely gotten the words out when he heard it, the distinctive whistle of an arrow cutting through air. Caleb threw himself sideways, the cavalry instincts still sharp after 13 years of civilian life. The arrow thudded into the ground where he'd been kneeling, the fletching quivering with the force of impact. 3 men appeared on the ridge above, silhouetted against the burning sky. They wore black clothing, simple and severe, and carried crossbows. Not Apache, not bandits. Something else, something organized. Another bolt flew toward him. Caleb rolled behind a boulder, his hand already moving to his holster. His fingers found the familiar grip of his Colt single-action army, a .45 caliber pistol with a 7.5-inch barrel. The weight of it in his hand was as familiar as his own heartbeat. The first man had made his mistake. He'd shown himself too clearly against the skyline outline, like a target at a shooting gallery. Caleb rose from behind the boulder, the Colt coming up smooth and natural. He exhaled, half a breath, steadied his hand, and squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked against his palm with a roar that echoed off the canyon walls. The man on the ridge jerked backward and fell tumbling down the slope in a cloud of dust. The other 2 disappeared from the ridgeline, but Caleb knew they hadn't gone far. Men like that didn't give up easy. Whatever their purpose here, whatever this woman had done to earn their judgment, they believed in it enough to kill for it. He had seconds, not minutes. Caleb holstered the Colt and returned to the woman, digging with renewed urgency. The blade bit into the earth around her shoulders, her arms. The soil gave way grudgingly, inch by inch. Her breathing came faster now, whether from hope or fear he couldn't tell. Another bolt struck the ground 3 feet away. Caleb drew his pistol again, fired twice toward the ridge without really aiming. He wasn't trying to hit them. He was buying time, making them think twice about showing themselves. The woman's shoulders came free, then her torso. She wore a simple dress, dark-colored and torn, the kind of plain garment that might belong to a servant or a nun. Beneath the dirt and sweat, he could see she was young, maybe 24 or 20 from. "Almost there," he said, returning to the digging. When he finally pulled her from the earth, she weighed almost nothing, just skin and bone and that iron determination he had seen in her eyes. Caleb lifted her in his arms, surprised at how light she was, and carried her to his gelding. Getting her onto the horse while under fire was the kind of maneuver they didn't teach in cavalry school. Caleb managed it through a combination of luck and desperation, hoisting her up and then mounting behind her in one fluid motion. One arm wrapped around her waist to hold her steady, the other gripping the reins. The 2 attackers appeared again on the ridge, closer now. Caleb fired the Colt once more, the bullet kicking up dirt at their feet, making them duck back. Then he spurred the gelding hard, and they raced across the valley floor. The sound of pursuit faded behind them as they crossed into territory Caleb knew better than any man alive. These were his acres, his land, earned through 5 years of backbreaking work and loneliness. He knew every draw, every wash, every place where a man could lose a trail or find cover. Behind him, the woman slumped against his chest, unconscious. The wooden sign still hung around her neck, swaying with the rhythm of the galloping horse. Caleb could feel her heartbeat against his arm. Faint, rapid, but alive. He didn't know her name, didn't know what she'd done to deserve being buried alive in the desert. But as he'd told himself when he pulled the trigger on that ridge, no one deserved to die like that. No one. The cabin came into view as the sun touched the western horizon. It stood alone at the base of a steep ridge, backed by ponderosa pines and facing the open valley. Good for seeing visitors long before they arrived. Bad for feeling like you had any neighbors within shouting distance. The structure was modest, 20 feet by 24 feet, built from logs Caleb had cut and hauled himself. A shake roof that leaked in two places during the summer monsoons. One main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, plus a smaller bedroom in the back. Outside stood a corral holding 2 Morgan horses and a mule, a small barn for hay and grain, and a chicken coop that rarely held more than 4 birds at a time. A stream ran 50 yards from the house, clear water that came down from the mountains. That stream was one reason Caleb had chosen this spot. The other was the view. From his porch, he could see 20 miles in 3 directions. In Arizona territory in 1878, that kind of visibility could mean the difference between life and a surprise visit from people who didn't have your best interests at heart. Caleb dismounted carefully, easing the woman down into his arms. She didn't stir. He carried her inside, shouldering open the door, and laid her on his bed. The bed where Sarah had died 3 years ago, calling out for water, he couldn't bring fast enough. Burning with fever, he couldn't cool. He pushed the memory away and went back outside to tend the gelding. The horse had earned its rest, and then some. Caleb unsaddled it, rubbed it down, gave it water and grain. The familiar motions were soothing. There was a rightness to caring for an animal that had carried you true. When he returned to the cabin, he brought his Winchester with him. The model 1873 chambered for 44 .40 caliber rounds. He'd bought it 2 years ago from a traveling merchant, and it had become his constant companion. More reliable than people he'd found. More honest, too. Inside, he barred the door and checked the windows. Old habits from the war, the kind that had kept him alive when plenty of better men had died. He positioned the Winchester near the door where he could reach it fast, then turned his attention to the woman on the bed. Her breathing had steadied some, though it still sounded labored. Caleb dipped a cloth in the water bucket and carefully cleaned the dirt from her face. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 23 or 24. Her skin was fair beneath the sunburn, her features delicate. The kind of face you'd expect to see in a parlor somewhere back east, not buried to the neck in Arizona hardpan. He lifted a cup of water to her lips. "Easy," he said softly. Small sips. Her throat worked, swallowing. Once, twice, 3 times. Then her eyes opened, those dark eyes that held more strength than seemed possible in someone who'd been left to die. Their gazes met and held. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Where?" she whispered, finally, her voice like sandpaper on wood. "Where am I?" "Safe," Caleb said. "My home. Name's Caleb Ashford." She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her. The effort alone was enough to make her collapse back against the pillow. "Sister Grace," she managed. Then softer, "No. Just Grace now, Grace Whitmore." Caleb nodded once and set the cup down on the table beside the bed. "Rest. We'll talk when you're stronger." "They'll come for me," Grace said, and there was no question in her voice, just flat certainty. "Let them come," Caleb replied. He picked up the wooden sign he'd removed from her neck and examined it in the lamplight. The words had been carved deep, probably with a knife, by someone who wanted them to last. Someone who wanted to make sure the message was clear. "What did you do to earn this?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "I existed," she said. That was enough. Before Caleb could respond, exhaustion claimed her. Her eyes slid closed, her breathing deepened, and she was asleep. Or unconscious. At this point, the distinction didn't matter much. Caleb stood and moved to the window, Winchester in hand. The last light was fading from the sky, turning the valley into a landscape of shadows. Somewhere out there, those men in black were probably regrouping, probably deciding what to do about the stranger who'd interfered with their execution. His mind drifted the way it often did in quiet moments back to Virginia. Back to the small house on the edge of town where Sarah used to wait for him, where Emma would run to greet him when he came home from the fields. He could still see them sometimes if he closed his eyes. Sarah's smile, Emma's blonde hair catching the sunlight. The winter of 1875 had been brutal. The influenza had swept through their town like a reaper's scythe, taking the young and old with equal indifference. Sarah had been the first to fall ill in their house. She tried to hide it at first, not wanting to worry him. By the time he realized how sick she was, the fever had taken hold. 5 days, that's all it took. 5 days of watching her waste away, of pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead, of listening to her delirious ramblings as the fever cooked her from the inside out. Emma had gotten sick 3 days after they buried Sarah. 6 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She'd lasted 4 days, calling for her mama even as Caleb held her hand and tried to be strong. He'd buried her next to Sarah in the town cemetery, 2 graves side by side. Then he'd gone home to that empty house and sat in the silence for 3 weeks, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but stare at the walls and wonder why he was still alive when they were gone. One morning he'd woken up and made a decision. He couldn't stay. Every room held memories. Every corner whispered with ghost voices. So he'd sold everything he owned, taken what little money he had, and headed west. As far west as he could go until he ran out of money in Arizona territory and decided that was far enough. The Homestead Act had given him a chance at something new. File a claim, prove up the land by living on it and improving it for 5 years, and it would be his. Free and clear. 160 acres of possibility in a place where no one knew him, where no one would look at him with pity and ask how he was holding up. He'd been here 3 years now. 2 more and the land would be his permanently. 2 more years of solitude and work and trying not to think too hard about the past. Now he had a half-dead woman in his bed and men in black who wanted her dead. He should have ridden on when he saw those vultures, should have minded his own business. But he hadn't. And now, for better or worse, Grace Whitmore was his problem. Caleb settled into the chair by the window, Winchester across his lap, and waited for morning. Dawn came with the sound of horses. Caleb was awake instantly, though he'd barely slept. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. 3 riders approached from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. He recognized the lead rider immediately. Sheriff Holloway, a man in his 50s who wore the star more out of lack of better options than any sense of civic duty. Behind him rode 2 men Caleb didn't know, but their type was familiar enough. Hired guns. The kind who'd do whatever you paid them to do and sleep just fine afterward. Caleb checked on Grace. She was still asleep, her breathing more regular now. He left the bedroom door open so he could hear if she stirred, then positioned himself by the front door with the Winchester ready. The rider stopped 20 yards from the cabin. Holloway dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose knees had seen better days. The 2 hired guns stayed mounted, hands resting casual on their saddle horns. Too casual. The kind of casual that meant they could go for their guns in a heartbeat. "Ashford," Holloway called out. "Got word you brought in some woman from the church folks." "That true?" Caleb opened the door just enough to speak through, keeping his body shielded by the frame. The Winchester rested in the crook of his arm, visible but not yet threatening. "What's in my house is my business, Holloway." One of the hired guns spat tobacco juice into the dirt. He was tall, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held about as much warmth as a snake. "Here she's a witch," he said. "Cursed. Her own people buried her for it." "Her own people can go to hell," Caleb replied evenly. Holloway shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Look, Ashford, I got no quarrel with you, but Baron Thornton sent me out here with a message." At the mention of Thornton's name, Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the man. Everyone in the territory had. Baron Thornton owned the largest spread of land in 3 counties, ran cattle by the thousands, and had enough money to buy whatever laws he needed. "What's Thornton want with me?" Caleb asked. "Says there's an issue with your land claim," Holloway said. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Says he's got a deed from 1872, older than yours." The words hit Caleb like a fist to the gut. His deed was filed in 1873, properly registered with the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. He'd paid his fees, followed every rule, done everything by the book. But if Thornton had papers from 1872, "That's a lie," Caleb said. "I filed legal and proper, got my claim through the Homestead Act." Holloway shrugged, putting the paper back in his pocket. "Not for me to decide. That's for the territorial judge to sort out. But until then, Thornton figures you're on his land. And harboring that woman, well, that just makes things more complicated." The second hired gun spoke up, his voice a low rasp. Church of Divine Purity wants her back. Says she's a sinner who needs proper judgment. Baron Thornton, he's a God-fearing man, made a deal with the church. He gives them support. They give him peace. Caleb worked the lever on the Winchester, the metallic click loud in the morning stillness. I've killed men for less than threats, Holloway. Don't make me add to that count. The tall hired gun's hand moved toward his pistol, but Holloway raised a hand to stop him. Easy now. No need for this to get bloody. Not yet, anyway. He climbed back onto his horse, his movements deliberate. You think on it, Ashford. Baron Thornton's a reasonable man. Give up the woman, we'll sort out the land situation peaceful-like. Keep her, and well, things are bound to get difficult. And the three riders turned and headed back the way they'd come. Caleb watched them until they were small specks in the distance, then closed and barred the door. Behind him, Grace spoke from the bedroom doorway. She'd managed to stand, though she gripped the frame for support. Her face was pale beneath the sunburn, but her eyes were clear. They'll come back, she said. Not a question. Yes, Caleb replied. They always do. Grace took a step into the room, then another. Her legs shook with the effort, but she stayed upright. You should have left me there. Now you're in danger because of me. Caleb set the Winchester down and turned to face her. I've been in danger before. Survived it then. I'll survive it now. You don't understand, Grace said, and her voice cracked. The church, Baron Thornton, they don't stop. They don't forgive. If you keep me here, they'll destroy you. Then they'll destroy me, Caleb said simply, but I won't hand you over to men who'd bury you alive. Grace stared at him, this stranger who'd saved her life, this man she didn't know from Adam. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust, still clinging to her skin. Why, she whispered. Why risk everything for someone like me? Caleb thought about Sarah and Emma, about the graves he'd left in Virginia, about all the things he'd failed to protect. He thought about the war, about the men he'd watched die, about the promises made and broken. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, and I've done enough wrong things in my life. Time I did something right. Grace slid down the doorframe until she was sitting on the floor, her strength finally giving out. Caleb moved to help her, but she waved him off. What's your name? She asked. Your full name, Caleb James Ashford. Used to be sergeant in the 3rd Virginia Cavalry. Now I'm just a man trying to hold on to a piece of land. Well, Caleb James Ashford, Grace said, and despite everything, there was the ghost of a smile on her lips. Thank you. Even if we both die for it, thank you. Caleb helped her back to bed, then returned to his post by the window. The sun was fully up now, turning the valley into a furnace. He could see the heat already rising in shimmering waves from the baked earth. Somewhere out there, Thornton and his hired guns were planning their next move. Somewhere out there, the Church of Divine Purity was deciding how to retrieve their lost sinner. And somewhere out there, time was running out. Caleb checked his ammunition. Winchester held 15 rounds in the tubular magazine. He had another 100 rounds in a box under his bed. The Colt held 6. Another 50 rounds for that in his saddlebags. Might be enough. Probably wouldn't be. The thought brought him back to the present, to the porch in 1918, to his grandson sitting on the steps listening to the story. Did you know, Thomas asked, his voice quiet, did you know right then that it would lead to a war? The old man opened his eyes and looked at the boy. I knew enough. I knew that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are against you. I knew that turning my back on Grace Whitmore would have been the safe choice, and I knew I couldn't live with that choice. But your land, Thomas said, they could take everything. They did try, but land without honor is just dirt, boy. Remember that. A man can lose his property and get it back. But once he loses his honor, once he becomes the kind of person who can watch injustice and do nothing, he's lost, something he can never recover. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The sun had fully set now, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. What happened next? He asked. Caleb smiled, though there was no humor in it. What happened next was preparation, because Grace was right. They did come back, and when they did, they brought hell with them. He stood slowly, his joints protesting, and handed the Winchester to his grandson. But that's a story for tomorrow night. Right now, you need to think about what I've told you. Think about whether revenge is worth your life. Think about what your father would want for you. Thomas took the rifle, feeling its weight, running his fingers over the same worn wood his grandfather had gripped 40 years ago. Grandfather. Yes. When they came back, were you scared? The old man looked out at the valley, at the land he'd fought for and bled for and almost died for. Scared of dying, yes, but more scared of living as a coward. That's the difference, boy. That's always the difference. He turned and walked to the door, each step measured and careful. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at his grandson. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the boy, about Sam Porter, about what it means to pass something on to the next generation. Because that's what all this was really about. Not the land, not the woman, not even justice. It was about making sure that good men, honest men, had a place to stand in this world, and that someone would still be standing there after we're gone. Then Caleb Ashford went inside, leaving Thomas alone with the rifle and the stars and the weight of decisions not yet made. In the darkness of the valley, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of juniper and sage. And somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, the ghosts of 1878 stirred, waiting for their story to continue. The third morning after Caleb had pulled Grace Whitmore from her grave, dawned clear and cold. A rare autumn chill had settled over the valley overnight, bringing with it the promise of winter still months away. Caleb stood on his porch Winchester, in the crook of his arm, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold. Behind him, inside the cabin, he could hear Grace moving about. She'd insisted on helping with the morning chores despite her lingering weakness. Stubborn woman. But Caleb had to admire that quality. In this country, stubbornness often meant the difference between survival and giving up. He was about to go check the water trough when he heard it. The soft scuff of boots on hard ground. Someone approaching from the north, moving careful and quiet. Caleb raised the Winchester, his thumb finding the hammer. A figure emerged from behind the barn, small, thin, moving with the hunched posture of someone expecting the blow at any moment. "That's far enough," Caleb called out, not pointing the rifle yet, but making it clear he could. "State your business." The figure stopped. Caleb could see now it was a boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old. He wore clothes that had once been decent, but were now torn and stained with the trail dust. His face was gaunt, the kind of hollow-cheeked look that came from too many missed meals. In his hands, he clutched a small bundle wrapped in what looked like an old shirt. "Please, mister," the boy said, his voice cracking. "I ain't here to cause trouble. I'm just looking for work. Any work. I can clean stables, mend fences, whatever you need." Caleb lowered the Winchester slightly. "What's your name, boy?" "Samuel Porter, sir. Most folks call me Sam." "Where's your family?" "Sam Porter." The boy's face tightened, and Caleb saw the flash of pain there before the kid could hide it. "Dead, sir. My pa worked for Baron Thornton. There was an accident last month. A wagon wheel broke and the wagon rolled over him. Ma died when I was born, so there's just me now." Caleb studied the boy more carefully. There was something in the way Sam held himself, a wariness that went beyond normal caution. This was a child who'd learned not to trust, who'd been hurt enough times to expect it. "Accident," Caleb repeated. "You believe that?" Sam's eyes widened, slightly surprised by the question. Then his expression hardened. "No, sir. Pa knew about things Mr. Thornton was doing. Forging land deeds, running people off their claims. Pa said he was going to report it to the territorial marshal. Next day, the wheel broke." The pieces fell into place in Caleb's mind. Thornton was cleaning up loose ends, removing anyone who might threaten his schemes, a hired hand who knew too much, a woman who'd accused a powerful reverend, anyone who stood in the way of money and power. "How old are you, Sam?" 12, sir. Almost 13. Caleb sighed. He should send the boy on his way. He had enough trouble already with Grace. In the coming storm he could feel building. Taking in a runaway kid would just add another complication. But when he looked at Sam Porter, he saw something else. He saw Emma, his daughter who'd never had the chance to grow up. He saw the chance to do something right to protect someone who needed protecting. "Can you work?" Caleb asked. "Yes, sir. I'm strong for my size. I can work from sunup to sundown and not complain." "Can you follow orders?" "Yes, sir." "Can you learn?" Sam hesitated, as if this was a trick question. "I want to learn, sir. I want to be able to read and write proper. Want to understand numbers and law and all the things Pa never got to teach me." Caleb made his decision. "You can stay, but you work and you learn and you do what I say without argument. There's trouble coming to this place, and if you're here, you'll be part of it. You understand?" And The boy's face transformed. Hope pure and brilliant replaced the wariness. I understand, sir. Thank you. I won't let you down. We'll see about that, Caleb said, but there was no harshness in his voice. Come on, let's get you some food and figure out where you'll sleep. Grace looked up from the stove when Caleb brought Sam inside. Her hand went instinctively to her stomach, a gesture Caleb had noticed her making more often in the past few days, protecting the life growing there, even if that life had come from violence. This is Sam Porter, Caleb said. He'll be staying on helping with the work. Sam, this is Miss Grace Whitmore. Grace studied the boy with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Then she smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since pulling her from the ground. Hello, Samuel. Are you hungry? Yes, ma'am, Sam said, and his voice was small and grateful. As Grace prepared a plate of beans and cornbread, Caleb watched the two of them. Grace moved with a gentleness around the boy, a maternal instinct that seemed to come naturally despite everything she'd endured. Sam ate with the desperate intensity of someone who wasn't sure where his next meal would come from. Looking at them, Caleb felt something shift inside him. For 3 years, this cabin had been a tomb, a place he existed but didn't live. Now suddenly it felt different. It felt like it might become a home again. Later that morning, after Sam had eaten and Grace had found him some of Caleb's old clothes to wear, Caleb gathered them both in the yard behind the cabin. If you're going to stay here, he said, you need to learn to protect yourselves. Both of you. He'd set up a row of tin cans on fence posts about 25 feet away. In his hands, he held a Remington Model 1875, a .44 caliber revolver he'd won in a card game 2 years back. It was a good gun, reliable and easier to handle than the Colt for someone learning. Sam, Grace, come here, Caleb said. I'm going to teach you something that might save your lives. Grace hesitated. I don't know if I can. Guns frighten me. They should frighten you, Caleb replied. Any fool who isn't frightened of a gun is too stupid to be trusted with one. But fear and respect are different things. I'm going to teach you to respect the weapons and use it right. He demonstrated the proper stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, 2 hands on the grip, arms extended, but not locked. Sight down the barrel, focus on the front sight, squeeze the trigger slow and steady. Don't jerk it, he said. Don't anticipate the recoil. Just squeeze smooth like you're trying not to break an egg. He fired. The can jumped off the post with a metallic clang. He handed the Remington to Grace, then positioned himself behind her, adjusting her grip and stance. Your turn, he said. Grace's hands trembled as she raised the pistol. The barrel wavered, moving in small circles as she tried to aim. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared and bucked in her hands, the recoil stronger than she'd expected. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet to the left of the target. That's all right, Caleb said. Nobody hits on their first try, unless they're lying about it being their first try. Sam stepped up next, his young face serious with concentration. Caleb showed him the same stance, the same grip. The boy was small for his age, and the Remington looked oversized in his hands. But when he fired, his shot came closer. Not a hit, but only 3 feet off target. Good, Caleb said. You've got steady hands. That's important. They practiced for 2 hours. By the end, Grace had managed to hit a can once out of 10 shots. Sam had hit 3. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tomorrow we do this again, Caleb said, reloading the Remington. And the day after, and the day after that, until you can do it without thinking, until the gun feels like an extension of your arm. Why, Grace? Grace asked. Why spend so much time on this? Caleb looked at her, then at Sam, then out at the valley beyond. Because in this world there are 2 kinds of people. Those who can defend themselves and those who die waiting for someone else to save them. I'm going to make sure you're the first kind. Over the next week, a routine developed. Mornings belonged to shooting practice. Caleb would set up targets at varying distances, teaching them about sight, picture, and trigger control, about breathing and follow through. Grace improved slowly but steadily. Sam improved faster, his young eyes and quick reflexes serving him well. Afternoons belonged to other skills. Caleb taught Sam how to mend fences, how to measure boards and drive nails straight. He showed the boy how to read the sky for weather, how to tell good water from bad, how to track an animal through sparse cover. A man who can build is never useless, Caleb told him as they replaced a section of corral fencing. Even if you never own land, Even if you spend your life working for wages, knowing how to make and fix things means you'll always have value. Sam absorbed every lesson like parched ground soaking up rain. The boy had a sharp mind and willing hands. More than that, he had hunger. Not just for food, though Grace made sure he got plenty of that, but for knowledge, for the chance to become something more than what he'd been born to. In the evenings after supper, Grace taught Sam to read. She'd found an old Bible in Caleb's belongings, one of the few things he'd brought from Virginia. Sarah's Bible, actually, with her name written inside the cover in careful script. Grace would sit with Sam at the table, lantern light pooling around them, working through passages. She had patience with the boy, never showing frustration when he stumbled over difficult words. Caleb would watch them, sometimes pretending to clean his guns or check his gear, but really just observing this small miracle of normal life. One evening, Grace looked up and caught him watching. Their eyes met across the cabin, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding, recognition. Two broken people finding unexpected purpose in helping a child who needed them. Later that night, after Sam had fallen asleep in the small loft space Caleb had rigged up for him, Grace and Caleb sat together on the porch. The autumn air had a bite to it now, and Grace wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "He's a good boy," she said softly. "He is," Caleb agreed. "You're good with him. Patient, kind. You must have been a wonderful father." The words hit harder than Caleb expected. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I try to be what Emma would have wanted, what she deserved." Grace reached out and placed her hand on his. The touch was brief there and gone in a heartbeat, but it carried weight. "She would be proud of you. Wherever she is, she would be proud." Caleb didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. And for the first time since Sarah and Emma had died, Caleb Ashford felt something like peace. But peace, he knew, was a fragile thing in Arizona territory, and his was about to shatter. On the morning of the 8th day, Caleb made his decision. He needed information, needed to understand what he was up against with a Thornton and this Church of Divine Purity. And there was only one place to get that information. "I'm riding to Redemption," he told Grace and Sam over breakfast. "I'll be back before dark." Grace's face tightened with worry. "Is that wise after what the sheriff said?" "Probably not," Caleb admitted. "But sitting here waiting for them to make the first move isn't wise either. I need to know what we're dealing with. And I need supplies. We're running low on ammunition." "I could come with you," Sam offered him. "No, you stay here. Help Grace with the chores. And both of you stay armed. Grace, you keep that Remington on you. Sam, the shotgun, stays within reach. Anyone comes by who isn't me or Ben Hartley, you don't open the door. You hear me?" They both nodded, though Sam looked disappointed at being left behind. Caleb saddled his gelding and checked his weapons. The Colt on his hip, the Winchester in its scabbard. He wore a long coat, despite the heat, useful for concealing the pistol and keeping trail dust off his clothes. Before he mounted, he pulled Grace aside. "If I'm not back by dark, you take Sam and you ride north. There's a ranch about 20 miles that way, run by a man named Charlie Wade. Tell him I sent you. He'll help." "You'll be back," Grace said, and her voice held more confidence than her eyes showed. "I intend to be," Caleb replied. Then he swung into the saddle and pointed the gelding toward town. Redemption wasn't much as towns went. A collection of wooden buildings clustered along a single rutted street, serving the scattered ranches and mines in the territory. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a few other establishments that came and went, depending on the economy and the whims of their owners. Caleb tied his horse outside the saloon and stepped inside. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, smelling of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey. A few men sat at tables, their conversation dying as Caleb entered. Small towns had long memories and active gossip mills. Everyone would know by now about the woman he'd rescued, about the sheriff's visit, about Thornton's interest in his land. At a corner table sat the man Caleb had come to see. Benjamin Hartley, though most folks called him One-Eyed Ben. He'd lost his left eye at Gettysburg, a Confederate mini-ball that should have killed him but somehow didn't. The socket was covered now with a leather patch, and he had a permanent squint with his remaining eye, as if he was trying to make up for the missing one by working it twice as hard. Ben and Caleb had served together, though, on opposite sides. They'd met years after the war, discovered their shared history, and formed the kind of friendship that only former soldiers could understand. Men who'd seen the elephant, as they used to say. Men who knew what it meant to stare at death and somehow walk away. Caleb crossed to Ben's table and sat down without asking. Ben looked up from his whiskey and gave a slow nod of greeting. "Heard you've been making trouble," Ben said, his voice rough as gravel in a bucket. "Heard the same about you," Caleb replied. "You still breathing, so it must not be too bad." Ben's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "What brings you to town? Thought you'd be holed up at your place preparing for the storm." Caleb pulled the wooden sign from his coat, the one that had hung around Grace's neck. He set it on the table between them. "Need to know what this means. Really means." Ben studied the sign, his one eye narrowing. His expression went dark. "Where'd you get this?" "Around the neck of a woman they buried alive in the desert. I dug her out." "Jesus, Caleb." Ben pushed the sign away like it might bite him. "You know what you've done, taking someone marked by the Church of Divine Purity. I know I saved a woman's life. The rest I'm still figuring out. That's why I need you to tell me about them, about this church." Ben was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was one of them, Caleb. 5 years ago, before I came to redemption, I was a member of the Church of Divine Purity." The confession hung in the air between them like gun smoke. Caleb hadn't expected that. Ben had always been private about his past, but Caleb had assumed it was just the normal reticence of a man who'd seen hard times. "Tell me," Caleb said. Ben took a long drink of whiskey, then began. "After the war, I was lost. No family left, no home to return to, no purpose. I drifted for years doing odd jobs, drinking too much, trying to forget. Then I met Reverend Silas Blackwell." The name sent a chill down Caleb's spine, though he couldn't say why. "Silas found me in a gutter in Tucson," Ben continued. "Literally in a gutter, passed out drunk. He cleaned me up, got me sober, brought me into the church. At first it seemed like salvation. We had community purpose rules to live by. Silas preached about purity, about cleansing the world of sin. Sounds like every other fire and brimstone preacher," Caleb said. "That's what I thought too. At first." Ben's hand trembled slightly as he poured another drink. "But then I saw what cleansing meant to them. The punishments, the judgments. They believed that sin could be washed away through suffering. And they believed that some sins were so great only death could cleanse them. Like burying someone alive," Caleb said quietly. Ben nodded. "I watched them stone a woman for adultery, helped them beat a man almost to death for stealing bread. Told myself it was righteous judgment, that these people deserved it." He looked up, his one eye wet. "The last straw was a girl, 16 years old, pregnant. They said she'd fornicated, brought shame on herself and her family. They decided she needed to be cleansed by the earth." Caleb's jaw clenched. "They buried her. I helped dig the hole." The words came out, broken, full of old pain. "Helped lower her in, helped pack the dirt around her. She cried the whole time, begging, saying it wasn't her fault, that she'd been forced. Nobody listened. Nobody cared." Ben wiped his face with a rough hand. "She died sometime in the night. I heard her screaming, stop around midnight. In the morning, I dug her back up. Just to be sure, I told myself. But really because I couldn't live with not knowing. And she was dead, eyes still open, dirt in her mouth where she tried to scream. I buried her properly that time, said words over her grave. Then I stole a horse and rode as far and as fast as I could. Changed my name from Benjamin Cross to Benjamin Hartley. Started over." The silence stretched between them. Outside, Caleb could hear the normal sounds of town life. Horses, wagons, voices. None of it seemed real compared to what Ben had just confessed. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb asked. "Because you need to know what you're up against. The church isn't just fanatics. They believe, truly believe, and that makes them more dangerous than any outlaw. You can negotiate with a man who wants money. You can't negotiate with a man who thinks he's doing God's work." "What about Thornton? Where does he fit?" Ben leaned forward. "That's the other thing you need to know. Baron Thornton isn't just some cattle baron. He's a member of the church, has been for years. He uses them and they use him. He gives them money and protection. They give him cover for his land grabs. How stuck. They brand people as sinners. Mark them with signs like that one. Ben pointed at the wooden sign. Once you're marked, you're fair game. Thornton's men can run you off your land, and nobody questions it because you're a sinner being judged. The law looks the other way because the church has influence with the territorial judge. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture Caleb didn't like at all. So Grace was marked. That means Thornton can claim she's on his land, that harboring her makes my claim invalid. Exactly. And it gets worse. Ben looked around to make sure no one was listening. Thornton's hiring guns. Lots of them. I heard he's got 15 men signed on already. He plans to drive out every small rancher in the valley by winter. Your place just happens to be first on the list. Caleb absorbed this information, his mind already working through implications and strategies. 15 men plus whatever church members Silas could muster. Against one man, a woman, and a boy. The odds weren't good. I need ammunition, Caleb said, and I need it without Thornton knowing I bought it. I can help with that, Ben replied. My shop's just across the street. Come on. They stood to leave, but before they could reach the door, it swung open. Two men stepped in backlit by the harsh sunlight. Caleb recognized them immediately. The hired guns who'd ridden with Sheriff Holloway. The tall one, the one who'd spit tobacco, grinned when he saw Caleb. Well, if it ain't the Indian lover himself, heard you're keeping some church whore at your place. Caleb kept his voice level, his hand loose at his side. I'm finishing my drink, then leaving. No trouble needed. Maybe trouble found you anyway, the second man said. He was shorter, stockier, with the flat eyes of a man who killed for money and slept just fine afterward. Mr. Thornton don't appreciate you ignoring his offer. And the church, well, they're real unhappy about you interfering with their judgment. The saloon had gone completely quiet. The other patrons pressed back against the walls, getting out of the line of fire. The bartender ducked behind the bar. Caleb knew what was coming. He'd seen it enough times during the war, and a few times since. That moment when words ended and violence began. The shift in the air, the tension that built until it had to break. Walk away, Caleb said. Both of you, walk away and we can all see tomorrow. The tall one's grin widened. I don't think so. His hand moved toward his pistol. It was the mistake Caleb had been waiting for. The man was fast, but he rushed it. Pulled his draw instead of making it smooth. Caleb's Colt cleared leather clean and fast, 40 years of practice making the motion automatic. He pivoted away from the table as he drew, creating distance and angle. The tall man's gun came up, but he was still bringing it to bear when Caleb fired. The Colt roared in the confined space, deafening. The bullet took the tall man's center mass, punching through his sternum and dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. The second man was already moving his gun, coming up faster, smarter. Caleb continued his pivot, dropping to one knee as the man fired. The bullet splintered wood above Caleb's head, so close he felt the wind of its passage. Caleb's second shot caught the man in the chest. The impact knocked him backward into a table which collapsed under his weight. He tried to raise his gun for another shot, but his strength was already gone. The pistol clattered from his fingers as he slumped to the floor. The whole thing had taken less than 5 seconds. Caleb stayed in his crouch, the Colt still raised, scanning for other threats. But the saloon remained frozen, every man watching with the wide-eyed stillness of people who'd just witnessed death up close. Then Caleb felt it, the burn. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his left shoulder. One of them, probably the second man, had scored a hit. The bullet had grazed him, cutting through coat and shirt and the top layer of skin. Damn, Caleb muttered. Ben was at his side instantly. Can you ride? Have to. Caleb holstered the Colt and stood his shoulder, screaming protest. Thornton will have the whole town after me now. Then move. I'll get your ammunition to you later. Go. Now. Caleb stumbled toward the door, his vision swimming slightly from shock and blood loss. Behind him, he could hear voices rising, people starting to react. Someone would fetch the sheriff. Someone else would ride for Thornton. The clock was ticking. He made it to his horse, pulled himself into the saddle through sheer determination. The gelding sensed his distress and stood steady, good animal that it was. Caleb pointed it toward home and gave it its head. The ride back was a blur of pain and heat and the rhythmic motion of the horse beneath him. Blood soaked his shirt, dripped onto his saddle, left a trail that anyone could follow. But Caleb didn't care about that now. He just needed to get home. needed to warn Grace and Sam, needed to prepare for what was coming, because it was coming now. No more waiting, no more wondering. He'd killed two of Thornton's men in front of witnesses. The war had started whether he was ready or not. The cabin came into view as the sun touched the western horizon. Grace and Sam were both outside and they ran to him as soon as they saw him slumped in the saddle. "Mr. Ashford." Sam's voice was high with fear. "You're bleeding." Grace was already reaching up to help him dismount. "Inside, now! Sam, get water boiling." They half carried him into the cabin, Grace surprisingly strong for someone who'd been buried alive just over a week ago. They got him into a chair, and Grace cut away his shirt with quick, efficient movements. The wound wasn't as bad as it looked, though it hurt like hell. The bullet had carved a furrow maybe 3 inches long across the top of his shoulder, deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to cause permanent damage. Lucky. Very lucky. Grace worked with the calm competence of someone who'd done this before. She cleaned the wound with hot water and whiskey, her touch gentle but thorough. Sam handed her supplies, watching with wide eyes. "What happened?" Grace asked as she worked. "Two of Thornton's men," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "They pushed it. I didn't have a choice." "Are they dead?" "Yes." Grace paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "Good," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "They chose their path." She finished bandaging the wound, wrapping it tight to stop the bleeding. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "They'll come now," she said. "Won't they?" "Yes," Caleb replied. "Soon, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but they'll come." Sam spoke up, his young voice steady despite the fear Caleb could see in his eyes. "I'll fight with you, Mr. Ashford. I can shoot now. Not great, but good enough." Caleb looked at the boy, seeing the determination there, seeing the courage that had nothing to do with not being afraid and everything to do with standing up despite fear. "I know you will, son," Caleb said, "and that's going to make all the difference." The stars were coming out when the old man's voice brought Thomas back to the present. They were still sitting on the porch, on the steps, Caleb in his rocking chair. But now there was a question hanging in the air, heavy and important. "Do you see now?" the old man asked. "Do you see why I'm telling you this?" Thomas thought about it, turning the pieces over in his mind. The woman, the choice to stand up even when it meant certain danger. "You didn't just fight for the land," Thomas said slowly. "You fought for them, for Grace and Sam." "Partly," Caleb agreed, "but there's more to it than that. When Sam showed up at my door, hungry and scared and alone, I saw a chance. Not just to help him, but to pass something on. Knowledge, skills, values. The things a man needs to survive and to be worth surviving." "Like you're trying to pass them to me," Thomas said. "Exactly like that. This story isn't just about what happened 40 years ago. It's about what matters now. It's about understanding that we don't just inherit land or money or property. We inherit responsibility. The responsibility to stand for something, to protect those who can't protect themselves, to teach the next generation so they can do the same." Thomas looked down at the Winchester in his hands. Sam learned to fight. He learned more than that. He learned to build, to read, to think. And yes, he learned to fight when he had to. But the fighting was never the point. The point was giving him the chance to become a man worth being. The old man stood, joints creaking. "Tomorrow night I'll tell you about the preparation, about how we got ready for what was coming, about Ben Hartley's sacrifice. But tonight you should think about what I've said, about what it means to leave something behind that matters." He paused at the door, looking back at his grandson. "Your father died in France fighting for something he believed in. He believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. He believed in standing against evil. That's your inheritance, Thomas. Not this land, though, that's yours too. But that spirit, that willingness to stand." Then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone with the stars and the rifle and thoughts that would keep him awake long into the night. In the darkness, the wind picked up again, carrying memories and promises and the weight of choices yet to be made. And somewhere in the past, in 1878, 3 people prepared for war. A man who'd lost everything and found purpose. A woman who'd been left for dead and discovered strength. And a boy who would grow into someone they could all be proud of. The story was far from over. The night after the shootout wrapped around the cabin like a shroud. Grace worked by lamplight, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. She'd cleaned gunshot wounds before back in the convent when miners or ranch hands would stumble in bleeding and desperate. But this was different. This wound belonged to a man who'd killed for her, who'd put himself in mortal danger because she existed. Caleb sat shirtless in the wooden chair, his jaw clenched against the pain. The bullet had carved a furrow across his shoulder deep enough that Grace could see exposed muscle beneath the torn skin. Blood had soaked through the hasty bandage she'd applied earlier and dripped onto the floor. Sam stood nearby, his young face pale but determined. He held the basin of hot water, watching as Grace worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to learn everything at once. "Hold still," Grace murmured, more to fill the silence than because Caleb needed the instruction. He hadn't moved except to breathe. She poured whiskey directly into the wound. Caleb's breath hissed between his teeth, but he made no other sound. The alcohol foamed pink in the gash, carrying away dirt and powder residue. Grace used clean cloth to dab at the edges, revealing the full extent of the damage. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "Another inch to the right, and it would have hit the bone. Another inch down, and it might have nicked the artery." "Doesn't feel lucky," Caleb replied, but there was a hint of humor in his voice. Grace threaded a needle with steady hands. She'd done this before too, though never on someone she cared about. The thought surprised her. When had she started caring about Caleb Ashford? This stranger who'd pulled her from the earth, who'd given her shelter, who'd killed men rather than give her up. She pushed the needle through skin, drawing the edges of the wound together with small, precise stitches. Caleb's shoulder tensed beneath her hands, but he kept still. Behind her, Sam watched with wide eyes, learning yet another harsh lesson about survival. "How did you know," Caleb asked suddenly, "how to do this?" Grace paused the needle halfway through another stitch. "The Sisters of Mercy ran a small infirmary. We cared for the sick and injured who had nowhere else to go. I spent 3 years working there before I took my vows. Before everything changed." She finished the stitching, 12 neat sutures holding the wound closed. Then she dressed it with clean bandages, soaked in a poultice made from herbs she'd gathered near the stream. Yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for healing. Knowledge from another life when she'd believed God had a purpose for her. "There," she said, tying off the final bandage. "Keep it clean. Change the dressing twice a day. And for God's sake, don't do anything stupid like getting shot again." Caleb flexed his shoulder, experimentally wincing. "I'll try to avoid it." Sam finally spoke up, his voice small. "Mr. Ashford, are they really coming?" "All those men." Caleb met the boy's eyes, and Grace saw him make a decision. He could lie, could soften the truth to spare Sam's fear. But instead, he chose honesty. "Yes," Caleb said. "They're coming, maybe tonight, probably tomorrow. But they're coming, and when they do, we'll have to fight." "I can fight," Sam said, trying to sound brave. "I've been practicing. I know you can, son, and that's going to matter." Caleb stood carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder. "But tonight I need you to get some rest. Grace and I have things to discuss, adult things. You understand?" Sam nodded, though disappointment flickered across his face. He climbed the ladder to his loft space, and soon they could hear the creak of the rope bed as he settled in. Grace and Caleb moved to the porch where the night air was cool and clean. The stars blazed overhead, so many and so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Grace pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat on the top step. Caleb eased himself down beside her, moving stiffly. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, the kind that exists between people who've shared danger and survived it together. Finally, Caleb broke it. "You asked me why I saved you, why I risked everything for a stranger." "I remember," Grace said. "I need to tell you something. About why I came west. About what I lost." He paused, staring out at the dark valley. "Her name was Sarah, my wife. We met in Virginia before the war, married in '71. She was the kindest person I ever knew. Patient, gentle. The kind of woman who'd nurse an injured bird back to health and cry when it flew away." Grace heard the pain in his voice, old and deep as a canyon. "We had a daughter, Emma. Born in '72, she had Sarah's blonde hair and my stubborn streak. Smart as a whip, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked." Caleb's voice cracked slightly. "She was 6 years old when she died." "What happened?" Grace asked softly. "Influenza. Winter of '75. swept through our town like wildfire. Sarah got sick first. She tried to hide it, didn't want to worry me. By the time I realized how bad it was, the fever had taken hold. He was quiet for a moment. She died on a Tuesday. 5 days of shuddering, and then she was gone. I buried her in the town cemetery under an oak tree she used to love. Grace's hand found his in the darkness. She didn't say anything, just held on. Emma got sick 3 days later, Caleb continued. She kept asking for her mama, kept saying she wanted to see her. I tried to explain that Sarah was in heaven, that she was with the angels. But Emma just cried and asked why the angels took her mama away. His breathing had gone ragged. She died calling for her mother, calling for someone who couldn't come. "Oh, Caleb," Grace whispered. "I buried her next to Sarah, put them side by side so they wouldn't be alone. Then I went home to that empty house and sat in the silence for 3 weeks. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but stare at the walls and wonder why God had left me alive when he'd taken them." He looked at Grace, and in the starlight she could see the wetness on his cheeks. "That's why I came west. That's why I'm here in the middle of nowhere trying to hold on to a piece of dirt. Because I couldn't stay there. Couldn't live in that house where everything reminded me of what I'd lost." Grace squeezed his hand tighter. "I lost everyone too. My parents died when I was 8. Disease like yours. I barely remember them now. Just flashes. My mother's voice. My father's laugh. The convent became my family after that." "Did it help?" Caleb asked. "Having that community, that purpose." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she had to say next. "For a while, yes. I grew up there, learned to read and write, learned about medicine and caring for the sick. When I was 20, I took my vows, became Sister Grace officially. I thought I'd found my calling, thought I'd spend my life serving God and helping others." "What changed?" Reverend Silas Blackwell, Grace said, and even speaking his name made her feel sick. "He came to the convent 2 years ago. He was already well known, the leader of this new church that preached about purity and righteousness. The Mother Superior was honored when he offered to provide spiritual guidance to our order. She pulled the blanket tighter, suddenly cold, despite the mild night. At first, everything seemed normal. He'd visit once a week, lead prayer services, give sermons. He was charismatic, compelling. He made you feel like you were part of something important, something holy." Grace's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was 22. I'd been at the convent for 14 years. I was happy there, or thought I was. Then one night about 6 months after he started visiting, Silas came to my cell. Caleb tensed beside her, but he didn't interrupt. It was after midnight. Everyone else was asleep. I heard the door open and thought it was Mother Superior come to check on someone who'd been sick. But it was him." Grace's breathing had gone shallow. "He said he'd been praying about me. Said God had shown him that I was special, chosen for a higher purpose. I was confused, but I trusted him. He was a man of God, a reverend. Why wouldn't I trust him?" Her hands were shaking now. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, careful of his wound, offering comfort and support. He started talking about purity, about how true servants of God had to be tested, about how the body was just a vessel for the soul. Grace's voice broke. Then he grabbed me. I tried to scream, but he covered my mouth. He was strong, so much stronger than I was. He pushed me down on the bed and She couldn't finish. The words stuck in her throat, choking her. But she didn't need to finish. Caleb understood. "That son of a bitch," Caleb said, his voice tight with fury. "That godless son of a bitch." When it was over, Grace continued, forcing the words out. "He told me this was my fault, that I'd tempted him with my beauty, that I'd led him into sin. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me. A lowly nun's word against a revered man of God." "You told them anyway," Caleb said. "The next morning, I went straight to Mother Superior. Told her everything. Begged her to believe me." Grace's laugh was bitter. "She didn't. She said I must have misunderstood, that perhaps I'd had a nightmare, that a man like Reverend Blackwell would never do such a thing. When I insisted, she got angry, said I was spreading lies about a holy man, that I should pray for forgiveness." "Jesus Christ," Caleb muttered. 3 months later, I realized I was pregnant. Grace's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, that protective gesture Caleb had seen before. I tried to hide it, but eventually it became obvious. When Mother Superior found out, she demanded to know who the father was. I told her again. Told her it was Silas Blackwell, that he'd forced himself on me. And she still didn't believe you. Worse, she said I was lying to cover my own sin, that I must have taken a lover and was trying to blame Reverend Blackwell to avoid punishment. She expelled me from the convent, literally threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. Grace's voice hardened. The Church of Divine Purity was waiting. They arrested me for fornication, for carrying a bastard child, for defiling my vows. Silas, Caleb said. Silas himself presided over my trial, if you can call it that. There was no defense, no chance to speak. He declared me guilty of seducing a man of God, of carrying the devil's seed. The punishment was to be cleansed by the earth. They would bury me alive and let God judge whether I lived or died. She turned to look at Caleb, her eyes fierce even through the tears. They dug that hole, put me in it, packed the dirt around my body until only my head showed. Then Silas hung that sign around my neck and walked away. Left me there to die, slowly calling it God's judgment. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she told him. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Grace, listen to me. What happened to you, what that bastard did, that wasn't your fault. None of it. You didn't seduce him. You didn't ask for it. You did nothing wrong. But I'm carrying his child, Grace said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. A monster's child. Every time I feel it move inside me, I'm reminded of what he did. No, Caleb said firmly. He shifted to face her directly, taking both her hands in his. You're carrying an innocent child. What Silas did doesn't define that baby. The child didn't ask to be conceived this way. It didn't choose its father. But you're choosing to be its mother. You're choosing to protect it, to give it life. That matters. How can you say that? How can you even look at me? Because I see you, Grace. I see your strength, your courage, your determination to survive, despite everything that's been done to you. He paused. And I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Grace met his eyes, seeing something there she couldn't quite name. If we survive this, Caleb said slowly, if we make it through what's coming, I want to help you raise that child. Not as its father, I know I can't replace anyone, but as someone who cares, someone who can provide for it, protect it, teach it. Caleb, you can't mean that. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave and kind. I know you've suffered more than anyone should, and you're still fighting. I know that child deserves a chance at a good life, regardless of how it was conceived. His grip on her hands tightened. I couldn't save Emma. I couldn't protect Sarah. But maybe I can help protect this child. Give it the life my daughter never got to have. Grace stared at him, overwhelmed. Why would you do this? Because for 3 years I've been dead inside, breathing but not living, existing but not having any purpose beyond getting through each day. Caleb's voice was raw with emotion. You and Sam, you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning that's about more than just survival. He released one of her hands to gently touch her stomach just for a moment. This child is innocent. It deserves to grow up knowing it's wanted, knowing it matters. I can't give it back the circumstances of its conception, but I can help give it a future, if you'll let me. Grace broke, then truly broke. She collapsed against Caleb's chest and sobbed, all the pain and fear and grief she'd been holding back pouring out in great racking cries. Caleb held her carefully, mindful of his wound and her condition, and let her cry. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly through the sky, indifferent to human suffering, but bearing witness nonetheless. When Grace's tears finally subsided, she pulled back and wiped her face with the blanket. I don't deserve your kindness. None of us deserve most of what we get in life, good or bad, Caleb replied. But we make choices about what to do with it. I'm choosing to stand with you. The question is, what do you choose? Grace thought about it, really thought about it. She could run, could take a horse and ride away, try to start over somewhere else where no one knew her story. But she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, and despite everything, she felt safer here with Caleb Ashford than she'd felt anywhere since the convent. I choose to stay, she said finally. I choose to fight. Caleb nodded satisfied. Then we'd better prepare, because they're coming, and when they do, we need to be ready. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb, despite his wounded shoulder, worked alongside Grace and Sam to turn the cabin into a fortress. They started with defensive positions. Caleb marked out where a trench should go about 30 feet from the cabin in a rough semicircle. The ground was hard-baked by the summer sun, but they worked in shifts, digging down 3 feet, making it 4 feet wide. The excavated dirt they piled on the cabin side of the trench, creating a low berm for cover. Why here? Sam asked as they dug. Distance and angle, Caleb explained. Too close and they can rush us before we can reload. Too far and we can't aim accurately. 30 feet is the sweet spot for rifles and pistols both. They camouflaged the trench with branches and tumbleweeds, making it look like natural terrain until you were right on top of it. In the bottom, they placed sharpened stakes angled outward 6 inches of pointed iron that would punch through boot leather and bone. Whisk came the wire. Caleb had a coil of steel wire in his barn intended for fencing. They strung it across the approaches to the cabin at about 2 feet off the ground, just high enough to catch a running horse at the knees. Impossible to see in dim light or when dust was kicked up. Around the windows, they stacked sandbags 3 feet high. Caleb showed Sam and Grace how to fill the bags properly, packing the sand tight so bullets wouldn't punch through. Each window became a firing position with good cover and clear fields of view. This is how we fought sometimes in the war, Caleb said as they worked. When we couldn't retreat and couldn't advance, we'd dig in, make the other side pay for every inch. Inside the cabin, they organized their weapons and ammunition. Caleb laid everything out on the table, taking inventory. Winchester Model 1873, 1 rifle, 200 rounds of 44-40 ammunition. Colt single action, Army 1 pistol, 100 rounds of them. 5 caliber ammunition, Remington Model 1875, 2 pistols, 150 rounds of 44 caliber ammunition. Shotgun 12 gauge 1 gun, 50 shells loaded with buckshot. Caleb assigned positions. I'll take the roof, best vantage point, and I can cover the most ground with the Winchester. Grace, you'll be at the west window with a Remington. Sam, you're at the back door with the shotgun. What about you? Grace asked. Your shoulder. Will hurt like hell, Caleb admitted, but I can still shoot. Been doing it for 40 years. Won't stop now. He taught them combat reloading, how to drop an empty magazine or cylinder and get a fresh one in place in seconds rather than minutes. Had them practice over and over until their hands knew the movements without thinking. In a fight, you don't have time to think, he said. Your body has to know what to do automatically. Muscle memory. That's what keeps you alive. Grace proved to be a quick learner. By the second day, she could hit a target at 50 feet more often than not and reload the Remington in under 10 seconds. Sam was slower but steady, his shotgun not requiring the same precision as the pistols. On the evening of the second day, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, they heard horses approaching. Caleb grabbed the Winchester and moved to the window, but relaxed when he recognized the rider. Ben Hartley slumped in his saddle, blood soaking through his shirt. They rushed out to help him. Ben nearly fell from his horse, would have if Caleb hadn't caught him. Together, Caleb and Sam got him inside while Grace prepared water and bandages. What happened? Caleb demanded as Grace cut away Ben's shirt. Overheard them, Ben gasped out. At the saloon, Thornton and Silas. They were planning the attack. I tried to leave quiet-like, but one of Thornton's men saw me. Shot me as I rode out. The wound was in his shoulder, similar to Caleb's, but deeper. The bullet was still in there, lodged against bone. Grace probed gently, her face grim. We need to get it out, she said. This will hurt. Everything hurts, Ben replied with a weak smile. Do what you have to do. While Grace worked on Ben, he told them what he'd learned. Baron Thornton had hired 12 guns professional killers who'd fought in range wars and railroad disputes. Reverend Silas had rallied 8 members of the Church of Divine Purity, true believers who thought they were doing God's work. 20 men total, 20 against 3 and a boy. When? Caleb asked. Dawn tomorrow, Ben said, then groaned as Grace pulled the bullet free with a pair of tongs. They're gathering tonight at Thornton's ranch, planning to hit you with everything at first light. Caleb absorbed this information, his mind already working through scenarios and contingencies. 20 men was more than he'd hoped for, but fewer than it could have been. And knowing when they were coming gave them one advantage: preparation. You need to run, Ben said, looking at Grace. You and the boy. Take horses and ride north. There's still time. Grace looked at Caleb. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding forged in shared danger and mutual respect. No, Grace said firmly. I ran once. They buried me for it. I won't run again. Sam spoke up from where he stood by the back door, shotgun in his hands. I ain't leaving either, Mr. Ashford. You took me in when I had nobody. I fight with you. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Pride, hope, the feeling of not being alone anymore. Then we stand together, he said, all of us. He looked around at them. Grace, who'd been broken and buried but refused to stay down. Sam, barely 12 years old, but with more courage than most grown men. Ben, who'd ridden here bleeding to warn them, even though he owed them nothing. These were his people now. His family forged not in blood, but in choice and circumstance. We've got tonight to finish preparations, Caleb said. Tomorrow when they come, we show them what it costs to prey on the innocent. We show them that some things are worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. He picked up the Winchester, checked the action, then set it back down. Grace, you'll take the west window like we planned. Sam back door with the shotgun. Ben, if you're up for it, the east window with the spare Remington. I'll be on the roof with the Winchester and Colt. 4 against 20, Ben said. I've faced worse odds. Have you? Sam asked. No, Ben admitted with a grim smile. But there's a first time for everything. They worked through the night making final preparations, checking weapons, distributing ammunition, going over fields of fire and fallback positions. Caleb showed them where he'd placed the traps, the hidden wires, and covered pits, so they wouldn't stumble into them in the chaos of battle. Around midnight, they took a break, sat together in the cabin eating a meal that might be their last. Grace had made biscuits and gravy simple but filling. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sam spoke up. Mr. Ashford, are you scared? Caleb considered the question seriously. Yes, son, I'm scared. Anyone who says they're not scared before a fight is either a liar or a fool. The question isn't whether you're scared, it's what you do despite being scared. What if we die? Sam asked quietly. Then we die standing up for something that matters, Caleb replied. That's more than a lot of men can say, but I don't plan on dying tomorrow. I plan on making it through so I can teach you to build that fence extension you wanted, so I can help Grace bring her baby into the world, so I can see what kind of man you grow up to be. He looked around at all of them. We've got right on our side. That counts for something. And we've got each other. That counts for even more. Grace reached across the table and took Caleb's hand. After a moment, Sam put his hand on top of theirs. Then Ben added his wounded shoulder and all. Together, Grace said. Together, they echoed. The stars were still bright when Caleb climbed to the porch for one last watch before dawn. To his surprise, Grace joined him, moving quietly so as not to wake Sam and Ben, who'd finally fallen into exhausted sleep inside. Couldn't sleep? Caleb asked. Too much to think about, Grace replied. She sat beside him on the steps, pulling a blanket around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. Tomorrow, everything changes. One way or another. It does. I want you to know something, Grace said, before tomorrow comes. I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. The belief that maybe, just maybe, I can have a life worth living. That this child I'm carrying can have a future. Grace, let me finish, she interrupted gently. When I was buried in that ground waiting to die, I made peace with it. I thought that was my ending. That I'd failed at everything I tried to be and deserved what I was getting. But then you came. You dug me out. You gave me water and shelter and kindness. You taught me to fight. And now, because of you, I believe I might actually survive this. Not just tomorrow, but all of it. The pregnancy, the memories, the fear. She turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her eyes were clear and bright. So, thank you, Caleb Ashford, for saving my life, for giving me purpose, for showing me that there are still good men in this world. Caleb didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate. So instead, he put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. She rested her head against his chest, careful of his wound, and they sat together watching the sky slowly lighten in the east. In 1918, on the porch of the same cabin, an old man named Caleb Ashford paused in his story. His grandson Thomas sat silent on the steps, absorbing everything he'd heard. So she told you the truth, Thomas said finally, about what happened to her. She did, Caleb confirmed, and in doing so she gave me a gift. She trusted me with her darkest pain. That kind of trust, you don't take it lightly. You honor it. You protect it. Is that why you fought for her? Partly, but also for Sam, for the principle of the thing, for the idea that in this world somewhere, someone has to stand up and say no more, that someone has to draw a line and defend it. The old man stood slowly, joints creaking. Tomorrow night I'll tell you about the battle, about what it cost and what we gained, about Ben's sacrifice and Grace's courage. But tonight you should rest. Think about what it means to stand with people, to make a family not out of blood but out of choice. He looked down at his grandson. Your father chose to stand with his brothers in arms across an ocean. That was his line, his fight. Now you need to decide what yours is, not because of anger or revenge, but because of belief, because of love. That's the only reason worth fighting for. Thomas nodded slowly, and in the gathering darkness, the old man could see understanding beginning to dawn in the boy's eyes. Tomorrow the story would continue. Tomorrow he would tell of battle and blood and the price of standing firm. But tonight he let the silence speak its own truth. In the darkness, the wind carried whispers of the past. And somewhere between memory and moment between then and now, the ghosts of good people who'd made hard choices waited to see how their story would end.